He handed over $1, a single dollar bill, and he walked away owning 80 acres of land. This was 1973. People thought he was crazy. They thought the land was worthless. They laughed at him for wasting even $1 on it. But he didn't care what they thought. He saw potential where others saw nothing. He moved on to that land. He cleared it. He built on it. He lived there. He raised his family there. Year after year. Decade after decade. He paid his property taxes every single year without fail. He kept every receipt, every record, every piece of documentation that proved the land was his. 50 years passed. The world changed around him. The remote area he'd bought into slowly transformed. Development crept closer. Roads improved. Businesses arrived. Property values exploded. And one day he discovered something shocking. His 80 acres that he'd bought for $1 were now worth $1.8 million. He'd become a millionaire without even trying. Just by living his life on land he'd purchased for the price of a candy bar. It seemed like the perfect story. A reward for patience and faith and hard work. But then the letter arrived. From a bank. A major bank with lawyers and resources and power. They said the land wasn't his. They said they had a claim to it. They said he owed them money or he'd lose everything. 50 years of life. 50 years of memories. 50 years of building. All of it threatened by a bank that appeared out of nowhere with documents he'd never seen before. And he had to decide whether to fight or surrender everything he'd built. His name was Robert Mitchell. He was 24 years old in 1973. He'd just finished a stint in the military. He had a little bit of savings. Not much. A few $1,000s at most. He was looking for a fresh start. Looking for a place where he could build something of his own. Looking for land where he could live simply and independently. The early 1970s were a strange time for property. The economy was struggling. Inflation was rising. Gas prices were spiking. People were uncertain about the future. Rural land, especially land far from cities, wasn't particularly valuable. People wanted to be close to jobs and services. Remote acreage was hard to sell. Robert heard about a county tax sale through a friend. The county was auctioning off properties where owners had failed to pay property taxes for multiple years. When property taxes go unpaid long enough, the county can seize the property and sell it to recover the tax debt. These sales happened regularly, but most people didn't pay attention to them. Robert went to the tax sale out of curiosity. He sat in the county courthouse with about a dozen other people. The auctioneer read through a list of properties. Most were small lots. A few were houses in disrepair. And then came the listing that caught his attention. 80 acres in the rural part of the county. No structures. No development. Just raw land. The opening bid was $1. The minimum the county could legally accept. The auctioneer waited. Nobody bid. These weren't desirable properties. People didn't want land with no road access and no utilities. People didn't want to deal with the complications of developing raw acreage. The auctioneer asked a second time. Still no bids. Robert raised his hand. He bid $1. The auctioneer looked around the room one final time. No other bids came. Going once. Going twice. Sold to the young man in the back for $1. Just like that, Robert owned 80 acres of land. He paid the $1. He paid the back taxes owed, which were a few $100s. He paid the administrative fees. The total cost was under $500 for 80 acres. It seemed too good to be true. And to most people, it was too good to be true because they believed the land was worthless. The property was remote. It was about 40 miles from the nearest town of any size. The roads leading to it were unpaved. There was no electricity running to the property. No water lines. No phone lines. No infrastructure at all. The land was heavily wooded. Dense forest covered most of it. There were no cleared areas. No buildings. No improvements of any kind. The previous owner had abandoned it years earlier. Let the taxes lapse. Walked away from it completely. Apparently they decided the land wasn't worth even the small annual tax bill. The county had tried to sell it previously at other tax sales but found no buyers. Robert was the first person willing to take it even for $1. When Robert told people what he'd bought, their reactions were mostly negative. His family thought he'd wasted his money. Friends told him he'd bought land nobody wanted for good reason. People said the property was too remote. Too undeveloped. Too impractical. They said he'd never be able to do anything with it. But Robert had a different vision. He saw 80 acres of possibility. He saw space. He saw freedom. He saw a place where he could build a life on his own terms without anyone telling him what to do. He wasn't thinking about property values or investment returns. He was thinking about having land of his own. He'd just bought his future for the price of $1. Robert didn't waste any time. Within weeks of the purchase, he was living on the property. Not in a house. Not even in a proper cabin. He started in a tent. A military surplus tent that he'd kept from his service days. He set it up in a clearing he'd made himself with a chainsaw and basic hand tools. This was going to be his home for now. And he was completely fine with that. He was young. He was capable. He was used to living rough from his military experience. Sleeping in a tent while he built something more permanent wasn't a hardship. It was just the beginning phase of a longer plan. He got up every morning with work to do. Clearing land. Cutting timber. Moving rocks. Building by hand what he couldn't afford to hire contractors to do. His first real structure was a small cabin. He built it himself using timber from trees he'd cleared on the property. He had basic carpentry skills from his childhood. His father had been a carpenter and had taught him the fundamentals. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was small and simple. But it was solid and it was his. He'd built it with his own hands from materials that came from his own land. Then came water. He needed a reliable water source. He had a well drilled. That was one of the first things he paid contractors to do because he didn't have the equipment. The well cost him a significant chunk of his savings. But it was essential. Without water, nothing else was possible. When the well came in clean and with good flow, he felt like he'd cleared a major obstacle. He installed a basic septic system. He ran electricity from the nearest power line, which required a significant run of wire but was eventually accomplished. He built an outbuilding for tools and equipment storage. He built a small barn for the animals he planned to keep. Each project added functionality and value to the property. He planted a garden. A substantial kitchen garden that grew vegetables and herbs. He kept chickens for eggs. Later he added a small number of cattle that grazed on pasture he'd carved out of the forest. He was building toward self-sufficiency. Not complete off-grid isolation, but a life where the land supported him as much as possible. The property taxes were modest. A few $100s per year in those early years. Robert paid them every single year without exception. He understood something fundamental about property ownership. Paying taxes was how you maintained your legal claim. Failing to pay taxes was exactly how he'd gotten the property in the first place. He wasn't going to make the same mistake as the previous owner. He kept every tax receipt, every payment confirmation, every piece of correspondence from the county about his property. He kept the original purchase documents from the tax sale. He kept everything organized in a filing system that he maintained carefully. He understood that documentation was protection. He'd seen enough of the world to know that disputes could arise and that having papers mattered. Years passed. Robert married a woman named Dorothy who shared his appreciation for simple living. She moved onto the property with him. They built a larger house together to replace the original cabin. Their children were born and raised on the 80 acres. The property became more than land. It became the foundation of a family. It became the place where a life was built, layer by layer, year by year, across decades. And through all of it, Robert kept paying his taxes. And kept his records. And kept building. The world doesn't stay still. That's something Robert learned over the decades he spent on his 80 acres. When he'd bought the land in 1973, it felt like the middle of nowhere. 40 miles from the nearest significant town. Unpaved roads. No utilities. No neighbors for miles. It was remote in a way that felt permanent. Like that part of the county would always be rural and undeveloped. But the world had other plans. The decades passed and the area began to change. Slowly at first. Then faster. Then very fast indeed. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a highway expansion project brought a major interstate closer to the area. Suddenly, what had felt impossibly remote was only 30 minutes from a growing city. Travel time changed everything. Distance in miles matters less when roads improve. What had taken an hour now took 30 minutes. The area became accessible in a way it never had been before. Through the 1980s, small businesses started appearing. A gas station at a nearby crossroads. A small grocery store. A feed store. These weren't big developments. They were modest. But they signaled something. They signaled that the area was being discovered. That people were starting to see potential in land that had previously been overlooked. The 1990s brought more significant change. A manufacturing company built a facility about 15 miles away. It created jobs. Jobs created housing demand. Housing demand pushed development outward from the city center. Subdivisions started appearing on land that had been farmland and forest. Each new development pushed prices higher for surrounding properties. Robert watched all of this happening around him. He wasn't trying to profit from it. He wasn't planning to sell. This was his home. He'd built his life here. He wasn't going anywhere. But he couldn't ignore that the world was changing rapidly around his property. By the 2000s, the transformation was dramatic. What had been remote rural land was now semi-rural land on the edge of a growing suburban area. Road access had improved significantly. The county had paved the roads leading to his property. Utilities were established throughout the area. What had taken significant investment to bring to his land in the 1970s was now standard infrastructure available throughout the region. Real estate agents started knocking on his door. They'd seen the county records. They knew his 80 acres sat in an area experiencing rapid appreciation. They wanted to list his property. They told him what they thought it was worth. He thanked them politely and told them he wasn't interested in selling. By the 2010s, the area had transformed completely. What had been wilderness was now a desirable semi-rural community. Large properties were selling for significant money. Developers were buying land to build subdivisions. Commercial development was expanding along the improved roads. The characteristics that had made the area remote and undesirable in 1973 had reversed entirely. Robert's 80 acres sat in the middle of all this transformation. His property had everything developers wanted. Size. Location. Road access. Utilities. It was surrounded by appreciated land. Comparable properties were selling for substantial amounts. He had an independent appraisal done out of simple curiosity. The appraiser came out and assessed the property carefully. The structures Robert had built over decades. The improved access. The utilities. The location within a now desirable area. The comparable sales in the surrounding region. The appraiser's report put the property value at $1.8 million. $1 in 1973 had become $1.8 million 50 years later. Robert held the report in his hands and shook his head slowly. He'd never been trying to make money. He'd just been trying to live. And somehow that had turned into this. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Robert was 74 years old by this point. He'd lived on that land for 50 years. He'd watched his children grow up there. He'd watched his grandchildren play in the same fields he'd cleared with his own hands decades ago. The property was his life. Every tree, every building, every fence post represented years of work and memory. He picked up the mail from his rural mailbox like he did every day. Among the usual bills and correspondence was an envelope from a bank. A major national bank. One of the biggest financial institutions in the country. He didn't recognize the bank's name in relation to anything in his life. He'd never borrowed money from them. He'd never had an account with them. He had no relationship with them whatsoever. He opened the envelope and read the letter carefully. And as he read, his face changed. The color drained from it. His hands tightened on the paper. Because what the letter said was impossible. Or at least it seemed impossible. The bank was claiming a lien on his property. They were saying that his 80 acres were subject to an unpaid mortgage debt. They were saying the debt dated back to the original property transaction. They were demanding payment of a substantial sum or threatening foreclosure proceedings. Robert read the letter 3 times. Each time he read it, he felt the same wave of disbelief. This couldn't be right. He'd bought the property at a county tax sale in 1973 for $1 plus back taxes and fees. He hadn't taken out a mortgage. He hadn't borrowed money from any bank to make the purchase. He'd paid cash. $1 in cash plus a few $100s in fees. There was no loan. There was no mortgage. There was no debt. But the bank's letter referenced documents. Documents they claimed proved the existence of a mortgage on the property predating his purchase. They claimed that when Robert had bought the property at the tax sale, he'd bought it subject to an existing lien. They claimed that the previous owner had taken out a mortgage years before abandoning the property. They claimed that mortgage had never been properly satisfied. They claimed they'd acquired that old mortgage through a series of bank mergers and acquisitions. And they claimed it was now Robert's problem. Robert immediately went to his filing system. The meticulous records he'd kept for 50 years. He pulled out the original purchase documents from the 1973 tax sale. He pulled out every tax receipt from every year since. He pulled out every piece of documentation related to the property. He spread it all on his kitchen table and went through it carefully. What he found was concerning. The original tax sale documents did reference the property as having been sold subject to existing liens. It was buried in the legal language. The kind of language that a 24-year-old without legal training might not have fully understood in 1973. He'd known there were back taxes. He hadn't fully understood that there might also be other encumbrances on the title. He called his son, who worked in real estate. His son came over immediately and reviewed the documents. He confirmed what Robert feared. The language in the original purchase was ambiguous. There was at least a possibility that the bank's claim had some basis in the original transaction documents. This was serious. A $1.8 million property was potentially at risk because of a 50-year-old mortgage that Robert had never known about. The bank with its lawyers and resources was coming after everything he'd built. Robert didn't panic. He'd been through hard times before. Military service had taught him to stay calm under pressure. 5 decades of building a life from nothing had taught him that problems could be solved if you approached them methodically. So instead of panicking, he made a phone call. He called a property lawyer. The lawyer he found specialized in real estate disputes and title issues. He had decades of experience dealing with exactly these kinds of complex property ownership questions. Robert brought every document he had. Every tax receipt. Every piece of correspondence. The original purchase documents from 1973. The appraisal report. The bank's letter. Everything. He spread it all out and walked the lawyer through 50 years of property history. The lawyer listened carefully. He asked detailed questions. He requested time to research the specific legal issues involved. He wanted to review the original tax sale laws from 1973. He wanted to research the bank's chain of ownership for the alleged mortgage. He wanted to understand exactly what legal claims the bank could legitimately make and what the statute of limitations might mean for a 50-year-old debt. When the lawyer came back with his analysis, the news was mixed but ultimately encouraging. Yes, the original purchase documents contained ambiguous language about existing liens. That was a real issue. The bank's claim wasn't completely frivolous. They had some basis for arguing that an old mortgage existed. The chain of ownership through bank mergers was complicated but not impossible to trace. But the bank faced significant legal obstacles. The first and most important was the statute of limitations. In most states, there are time limits on how long a creditor can wait before enforcing a debt. 50 years is an extraordinarily long time. The lawyer researched the applicable statute of limitations carefully. He found that the limitations period for enforcing the kind of claim the bank was making had almost certainly expired decades ago. The second obstacle was adverse possession. Robert had openly occupied and improved the property for 50 years. He'd paid taxes on it for 50 years. He'd treated it as his own in every possible way for 50 years. Adverse possession laws exist in every state. They establish that when someone openly occupies property, pays taxes, and improves it over a long period, they can establish ownership rights that override even prior claims. The third obstacle was laches. This is a legal doctrine that prevents someone from bringing a claim when they've waited an unreasonably long time and that delay has caused harm. A bank waiting 50 years to enforce a mortgage while the property owner built his entire life on the land would face a serious laches argument. Courts don't look favorably on creditors who sleep on their rights for decades and then suddenly appear to claim valuable property. The lawyer also researched the bank's chain of acquisition. The mortgage had allegedly passed through multiple bank mergers and acquisitions over 50 years. Each transfer had to be properly documented. Each transfer had to maintain the integrity of the original claim. The lawyer found irregularities. Documents that were missing. Transfers that weren't properly recorded. The bank's chain of ownership for this old mortgage was incomplete and potentially legally defective. Robert listened to all of this carefully. He asked questions. He made notes. His military background had given him an ability to process complex information systematically. He understood the legal landscape now. He understood his strengths and the bank's weaknesses. And he understood that this fight was winnable. He told his lawyer to proceed. He wasn't going to surrender 50 years of his life to a bank with a defective 50-year-old claim. The legal battle formally began when Robert's lawyer filed a response to the bank's claim. The response was comprehensive. It challenged every aspect of the bank's position. It raised the statute of limitations defense. It raised the adverse possession argument. It raised the laches doctrine. It challenged the completeness of the bank's documentation. It was a thorough and aggressive legal response that put the bank on notice that Robert wasn't going to simply comply with their demands. The bank's legal team responded with their own comprehensive filing. They had resources. They had experienced property lawyers. They had corporate backing. They were used to intimidating individual property owners into settling rather than fighting. They probably assumed Robert would eventually back down. That the stress and expense of litigation would wear him down. That he'd agree to some kind of payment arrangement rather than risk losing everything in court. They didn't know Robert Mitchell. The discovery process began. Both sides exchanged documents. Robert's lawyer requested every document the bank had related to the alleged mortgage. Every record of the original loan. Every document showing the chain of transfers through bank mergers. Every communication about the property over 50 years. Every internal bank record related to this claim. What came back was revealing. The bank's documentation was incomplete. The original mortgage documents were present, but subsequent transfer records had gaps. A key transfer document from one bank merger in the 1990s was missing entirely. Without that document, the bank couldn't prove continuous and unbroken ownership of the alleged mortgage. Their chain of title had a hole in it. Robert's lawyer also submitted evidence of Robert's 50 years of occupation and improvement. Tax payment records going back to 1973. Receipts for improvements made to the property. Photographs showing the development of the property over decades. Witness statements from neighbors who'd known Robert and the property for 30 or 40 years. Statements from local officials who confirmed his continuous presence and ownership. The community rallied around Robert. Neighbors who'd known him for decades wrote statements on his behalf. Local officials who dealt with him as a property owner over the years provided documentation. People who'd watched him build his life on that land step by step were willing to testify. The community support was both emotionally meaningful and legally valuable. The judge presiding over the case reviewed the evidence carefully. She was experienced in property law. She understood the complex legal questions involved. She questioned both legal teams thoroughly during hearings. She pressed the bank's lawyers about their documentation gaps. She pressed them about the statute of limitations. She pressed them about the 50-year delay in enforcing their alleged claim. The bank's lawyers struggled to provide satisfactory answers. They tried to argue that the statute of limitations had been told for various reasons. The judge wasn't persuaded. They tried to argue that the missing transfer document could be reconstructed from other records. The judge wasn't persuaded. They tried to argue that adverse possession didn't apply because the bank had a recorded lien. The judge examined this argument carefully but ultimately found it unpersuasive given the specific facts and timeline. The hearing took several months. Evidence was reviewed. Arguments were made. Legal precedents were cited. Robert attended every hearing. He sat quietly and listened to lawyers argue about his life and his property. He remained calm throughout. He trusted his lawyer. He trusted the evidence. He trusted that 50 years of doing everything right would matter in the end. And then the judge issued her ruling. A comprehensive written decision that addressed every legal argument both sides had raised. Robert's lawyer called him the moment the ruling came through. The news was everything Robert had hoped for. The judge's ruling was clear and decisive. She found that the bank's claim was barred by the statute of limitations. Under the applicable state law, a mortgage creditor has a specific time period within which to enforce their claim. That period had long expired. 50 years had passed since the original mortgage was allegedly created. The bank had waited far too long to assert their claim. The judge also found that Robert had established a valid adverse possession claim. He had openly occupied the property for 50 years. He had made significant improvements to the property. He had paid property taxes continuously for 50 years. He had treated the property as his own in every possible way. Under adverse possession law, these facts established that Robert had acquired ownership rights that superseded any prior claim the bank might have had. The judge further found that the bank's failure to enforce its alleged claim for 50 years, combined with Robert's reliance on his ownership through building his entire life on the property, constituted legal laches. The doctrine prevented the bank from bringing a claim now after such an unconscionable delay. The harm to Robert of losing property he'd occupied and improved for 50 years far outweighed any benefit the bank might receive from enforcing a 50-year-old, incompletely documented claim. The judge concluded that Robert Mitchell was the rightful owner of the 80 acres. The property was his free and clear. The bank's alleged lien was invalid. The bank had no claim whatsoever to the property. The ruling was comprehensive and left the bank virtually no grounds for appeal. Robert sat quietly when his lawyer read the decision to him. He didn't celebrate loudly. That wasn't his way. But his shoulders relaxed. The tension that had gripped him since receiving the bank's letter finally released. 50 years of building. 50 years of work. 50 years of memories. It was all his. The bank couldn't take it. The bank's response was initially angry. They filed a notice that they would appeal the decision. Robert's lawyer wasn't concerned. The appellate court would review the same evidence and reach the same conclusion. The lower court's ruling was sound legally. The bank's arguments were weak. An appeal was unlikely to succeed. After several months, the bank withdrew their appeal notice. Their lawyers had apparently done their own analysis and concluded that appealing was pointless. The lower court ruling would almost certainly be upheld. Continuing to fight would only cost more money with no realistic chance of success. They let the matter drop. The legal victory was complete. Robert's ownership was affirmed. His title was clear. The property was indisputably his. He'd fought the bank with limited resources and he'd won. But Robert didn't immediately think about selling the property now that its value was unencumbered and established. That wasn't what he cared about. What he cared about was that his home was secure. That what he'd built over 50 years couldn't be taken from him. That his family's legacy was protected. That the land he'd worked so hard to improve was legally and permanently his. He continued living on the property exactly as he had been. The house that he and Dorothy had built together. The outbuildings and structures he'd created. The gardens he'd planted. The memories that filled every corner. That was what mattered. The $1.8 million valuation was interesting but ultimately irrelevant to him. He'd bought 80 acres for $1 in 1973 to build a life. He'd done exactly that. And no bank was going to take it away from him. The case generated significant local attention. Newspapers ran stories about the man who'd bought 80 acres for $1 and fought off a major bank's claim to keep it. The story resonated with people. It was David versus Goliath. It was an individual standing up to corporate power and winning. It was proof that the legal system could work for ordinary people when they had justice on their side. Robert received calls from real estate agents wanting to list the property. The legal victory had clarified title. The $1.8 million valuation was now unencumbered. It was a valuable asset that could be sold for significant money. Wouldn't he want to retire wealthy? Wouldn't he want to travel? Wouldn't he want to enjoy the financial fruits of his 50-year investment? Robert politely declined every inquiry. He didn't buy the land as an investment. He bought it as a home. He'd built his life there. His children had grown up there. His grandchildren played there. The property was worth infinitely more to him as a place to live than it was worth as a number on a financial statement. He had no intention of selling. But the case itself held important lessons. Lessons that extended far beyond Robert's specific situation. The case established legal precedent about statute of limitations in property disputes. It established that adverse possession rights could overcome even documented historical claims under certain circumstances. It clarified that courts would apply the doctrine of laches to prevent creditors from sleeping on their rights for unconscionable periods of time. Property lawyers cited the case. Law students studied it. The ruling became a reference point for how courts should handle old property claims and disputed titles. Robert's victory meant more than just protecting his own property. It meant establishing legal protections that could benefit other property owners facing similar situations. The case also highlighted the importance of documentation. Robert's 50 years of tax receipts had been crucial. His consistent property tax payments proved continuous ownership and responsibility. His records of improvements to the property supported his adverse possession claim. His organized filing system meant he had everything he needed when the challenge came. If he'd been careless with documentation, if he'd lost receipts, if he'd failed to keep records, his legal position would have been much weaker. The experience reinforced something Robert already knew. Paperwork matters. Documentation matters. Keeping records matters. In a legal dispute, evidence is everything. Robert had spent 50 years keeping meticulous records almost unconsciously. He was the kind of man who organized his bills and receipts and correspondence. He paid attention to details. And those habits had protected him when a major bank tried to claim his property. Years passed after the legal victory. Robert continued living on the land he'd bought for $1. Dorothy passed away in her 80s. Robert continued living there, surrounded by the life they'd built together. His children and grandchildren visited regularly. They walked the property that had been in the family for 50 years. They understood its value not in dollars but in memories and family history. Robert eventually passed the property to his children, free and clear of any encumbrances, with a clear legal title confirmed by court decision. The 80 acres that had cost $1 and a few $100s in fees in 1973 became a family legacy. Worth $1.8 million not because Robert tried to make money, but because the world changed around the land he loved and because he refused to let anyone take it from him. The bank's claim had been forgotten. The legal battle was ancient history. What remained was the land and the family and the life built there across 50 years of patience, work, and determination. That was the real value. That was what mattered.